It was just 2 weeks until Christmas, and Mr. Obi's home buzzed with energy. The children dashed around, bubbling with excitement for their upcoming trip to the village, blissfully unaware of the dark fate that awaited them. This wasn't their first journey. Every year, they returned home for the holidays, cherishing the rare moments spent with family in the village. It was a family tradition that they all looked forward to. The kids adored the fresh air, towering trees, and the chance to play with their cousins and village friends. However, this year would unfold in a way they could never have anticipated, tragically and horrifically. Meanwhile, Mrs. Obi busied herself with packing clothes and preparing snacks for the road. She always take out time to organize everything well in advance, ensuring nothing was overlooked or forgotten. Yet, one concern lingered in her mind: Mr. Obi's reluctance to pray. "Obi, can we please take just 2 minutes to pray? I don't like the feeling I'm getting about this travel," she asked, folding clothes into a suitcase. Mr. Obi waved dismissively, as if swatting away a pesky fly. "Don't bother me. God knows I'm traveling. He doesn't need a reminder to keep us safe. And moreover, this is not the first time we are traveling home for Christmas," he chuckled. Mrs. Obi felt a weight in her heart as she gazed at her husband, shaking her head in frustration. "Why can't you see?" she murmured to herself. 2 days earlier, Mrs. Obi experienced a horrifying dream in which they were all caught in an accident, resulting in everyone's demise. Despite her efforts to pray whenever possible, her older children seemed to follow in their father's footsteps, showing little concern. When she knelt for morning prayers, they would groan and drag their feet, asking, "Mama, why do we have to pray every day? It's so boring." Despite their antics, she remained steadfast, praying for her family and seeking God's protection. Deep down, she longed for Mr. Obi to join her, even just once. The house was alive with laughter and chatter as the children excitedly discussed their plans for the village. Mr. Obi beamed at their joy, but Mrs. Obi sat quietly, observing her family. She held her breath and offered a silent prayer. "Lord, keep us safe this Christmas." As the days drew nearer to the holiday, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. As Christmas approached, the family remained unaware of the challenges that lay ahead. Challenges that would test their faith and alter their lives forever. One evening, Mr. Obi was driving home from work, his thoughts focused on the road. As he rounded a corner, he spotted an elderly woman standing by the roadside, waving for assistance. Her shawl was tightly wrapped around her waist, and she held a small basket in her hand. Mr. Obi slowed down and pulled over beside her. "Ma'am, where are you headed?" he inquired, leaning out of the window. "My son," the old woman replied, her voice weary. "I'm going down the next street. Could you give me a lift?" Mr. Obi nodded. "Hop in, ma'am." The old woman climbed into the car, settling quietly into the seat. For a while, they drove in silence, the only sounds being the hum of the engine and the distant chirping of crickets. Then, the old woman cleared her throat. "My son," she began softly, "I hope you won't be upset by what I'm about to say." Curious, Mr. Obi glanced at her. "What is it, ma'am?" Taking a deep breath, she continued, "This Christmas, you should reconsider traveling to your village. If you must go, please ensure that you and your family pray and fast before the journey. There is danger ahead." Her words lingered in the air like a heavy fog. Mr. Obi let out a hearty laugh, causing the old woman's expression to tighten. "Mama, why should we stop? It's just the village." "This isn't my first Christmas trip. Nothing will happen," he said, shaking his head dismissively. The old woman looked at him, her eyes dark and serious. "I've said what I needed to say. The rest is up to you, my son." When they arrived at her destination, Mr. Obi stopped the car and the old woman stepped out. She turned to him one last time. "Thank you for the ride. Remember my words. Pray and fast if you must go." Mr. Obi waved her off with a smile. "Thank you, Mom. Take care." As he drove away, he smiled and thanked the old woman, wishing her to take care. Lost in thought, he pondered why people enjoyed frightening others with their tales. He reassured himself that she was merely being superstitious or attempting to sound wise. After all, he had made this journey countless times without any incident. However, as the car faded into the twilight, the old woman remained, her expression unreadable. With just 2 days until Christmas, the house buzzed with anticipation. Bags filled with clothes, gifts, and snacks were piled by the door, ready for the long trip. The children twirled around, chattering excitedly about the village and the fun they would have with their cousins, relatives, and village friends. "Let's pray before we leave," Adaobi said, her voice a soothing blend of gentleness and authority. Mr. Obi frowned, exasperated. "What's with you and prayers? We're not heading to the moon. It's just the village." "Let me warm up the car," he said, dismissing her with a wave. She sighed and knelt down to pray with the children, whispering her familiar request to God for protection and guidance. Outside, Mr. Obi settled into the driver's seat, turned the ignition, and waited. Instead of the familiar roar of the engine, there was only silence. He tried again, and the car sputtered weakly, but refused to start. "What's going on now?" he muttered, stepping out to pop the hood and inspect the engine, hoping it would provide some answers. After fiddling with a few wires, he attempted to start it once more, but the car remained stubbornly silent. Frustrated, he returned inside to inform her. "The car won't start," he said, scratching his head in confusion. She looked at him, calm as ever, and suggested softly, "Maybe God doesn't want us to go." Mr. Obi snapped back. "Stop saying that. What does God have to do with a car engine? I'll call the mechanic." The mechanic arrived promptly, his tools clanging as he examined the vehicle. After a few minutes, he stood up and shook his head. "The engine has knocked. This car isn't going anywhere until it's fixed." Mr. Obi's jaw dropped. "Knocked? I drove this car yesterday and it was fine." The mechanic shrugged. "Sometimes these things just happen, sir." "It's beyond me." Mrs. Obi offered a faint smile. "God knows why," she said steadily, but Mr. Obi wouldn't listen. "God knows why?" he mimicked sarcastically. "So now what? Are we just going to stay here and cancel Christmas?" Mrs. Obi remained silent, watching her husband pace the room like a restless lion. After a moment, Mr. Obi clapped his hands and declared, "We'll go to the park and take a commercial bus. It's not ideal, but we'll still make it to the village." His wife frowned. "Maybe we shouldn't go at all," she suggested gently. "Don't start again, Adaobi," Mr. Obi snapped. "I've made up my mind." With that, the decision was made. They repacked their bags for the bus, and the children, still excited, prepared for the journey. But Adaobi's heart felt heavy, and she prayed silently, "Lord, take control." What Mr. Obi and his family didn't know was that not everyone was happy with their yearly Christmas visit. Far away in the village, the air was still, but Mama Emeka's heart was filled with noise. She sat outside her mud house, staring at the dusty road, her face twisted in bitterness. Every year, Mr. Obi and his family arrived like royalty, their shiny car attracting all eyes, while his wife Adaobi and their children appeared well-fed and joyful. She jealously thought to herself. Every Christmas, all eyes were always on Obi's wife and their children, who appeared well-fed and happy. Meanwhile, her 4 sons struggled to make their way home, often relying on old bicycles or walking. Mama Emeka clenched her fist, muttering under her breath, "Why does every Christmas revolve around Obi and his family?" Her heart simmered with jealousy, and she resolved that this year would be different. Mama Emeka had never quite gotten over the loss. In her youth, She had been the village beauty, prized by suitors, envied by the other women. But that was before the loss, before everything changed. Years ago, she had gotten married to a wealthy merchant from the neighboring village, a man with influence and resources. But after the marriage, she was cast aside for a younger woman, a woman who was more obedient, more pious, and more fitting for the life he had promised. And that was Obi's mother. The pain of rejection had never fully healed, and now she watched Obi and his family with a mixture of jealousy and contempt. She believed that Obi has what her children were supposed to have, and so she summoned her closest friend, Mama Obina. "I can't stand it any longer," she whispered. "This year, that boy and his family won't come here to flaunt their riches." Mama Obina, known for her sharp tongue, nodded in agreement. "You're right, Mama Emeka. It's time to take action." Without delay, the two women ventured deep into the forest where the village witches resided. The forest path stretched endlessly, swallowed by the dense, suffocating darkness. The air grew heavier with every step, thick with an unnatural stillness that made every rustling leaf seem like a distant whisper. At the entrance of the hut, a foul-smelling incense lingered in the air, mixing with the earthy stench of damp soil. The witches were gathered around a massive cauldron, their forms hunched in dark robes that seemed to absorb the light, making them appear like shadowy silhouettes against the flickering flames. Upon reaching the witches' hut, a chilling wind swept through, sending shivers down their spines. The leader of the witches, an ancient woman with a face as crinkled as a dried leaf, greeted them with a voice that rumbled like thunder. "What brings you here?" Mama Emeka knelt, her head bowed in submission. "I seek your assistance. My stepson Obi must not arrive in this village alive. His success has brought shame to me and my children for far too long." The witches erupted in laughter, their cackles reminiscent of shattering glass. "Is that all?" the leader asked, her eyes gleaming. "Consider it done." They gathered around a cauldron filled with a thick, bubbling black liquid. One witch tossed in a piece of cloth that Mama Emeka had brought, a fragment of Obi's shirt from his last visit. Another witch added ashes, murmuring incantations that twisted the very air around them. The leader raised her hand, silencing the room. "They will not reach this village alive," she proclaimed. "A fatal accident awaits them on their journey." Mama Emeka's heart raced with anticipation. Mama Emeka's heart brimmed with a dark sense of joy as she handed over a few coins in payment. The witches cackled, preparing to cast the final curse. "It is done!" the leader declared, her voice as cold as stone. That night, Mama Emeka returned home, her expression serene while her heart danced with anticipation. She envisioned Obi's car wrecked, his family gone, and the villagers in mourning. At last, her sons would no longer be overshadowed. The following morning, Mr. Obi and his family arrived at the park, bustling with travelers and vendors, shouting about bread, sachets of water, and roasted corn. The children clutched their bags, excitement bubbling as they watched buses being loaded with luggage. Mr. Obi, holding the tickets, led his family to a bus. It wasn't as cozy as their car, but it would take them to the village. As they settled into their seats, Ada Obi's voice cut through the chatter. "Please let us pray before the journey begins," she said, standing and addressing the passengers. Some nodded and closed their eyes, while others ignored her, whispering among themselves. Mr. Obi's face flushed with embarrassment. "Ada Obi, sit down," he hissed. "You're embarrassing me. This is public transport, not church." But Ada Obi remained undeterred, closing her eyes and speaking firmly. "Lord, protect us on this journey. Cover this bus and everyone inside it. Amen." Some passengers mumbled their agreement, while others rolled their eyes. Mr. Obi shook his head, muttering that she would never change. The bus roared to life and pulled away, the city gradually fading into the background. The children laughed and chattered, pointing out sights along the way. "Daddy, see that donkey," the last-born said. Another shouted, "Mummy, that man's car looks like ours." After looking at the direction of the children, Mr. Obi, feeling the gentle sway of the bus, dozed off with his head resting against the window. For a while, tranquility reigned as the road unfurled ahead, the gentle hum of the engine resonating in the air. However, as they neared the midpoint of their journey, everything shifted. Suddenly, the driver's voice pierced the serene atmosphere, shouting, "The brakes! The brakes aren't working!" His hands clutched the steering wheel with desperation. Panic surged through the bus as passengers screamed, the vehicle swerving wildly from side to side. Adaobi held her children tightly, her lips moving in a silent plea. Ahead, a massive tanker truck loomed, dominating the road. The driver fought to regain control, but it was futile. The bus hurtled toward the tanker, the screeching of tires and terrified cries filling the air. In those harrowing moments, time seemed to stretch. Adaobi's voice rose above the chaos, pleading, "Lord, save us!" Then, with a thunderous crash, the bus collided with the tanker, metal crumpling, glass shattering, and an eerie silence enveloping the scene. Meanwhile, in the distant village, the wind carried whispers of the accident, spreading the news to eager ears. Yet, the fate of the survivors remained a mystery. The news raced like wildfire, propelled by the wind, reaching Mr. Obi's village before sunset, where people began to gather in anxious clusters. People clustered in small groups, their voices low and heads shaking. "Did you hear about Obi and his family? They were in a terrible accident." Mama Emeka caught wind of the news as well, collapsing to the ground in anguish, her wrapper fluttering as she pounded her chest. "Oh, my son, my stepchildren, what have we done to deserve this?" she lamented, her voice rising for all to hear. Yet, beneath her sorrow, a dark satisfaction bubbled within her. She believed her scheme had succeeded. "Now no one will overshadow my sons," she thought, her tears merely a facade. At the crash site, help finally arrived. Amidst the wreckage, Adaobi and her children were discovered shaken but miraculously unharmed, not a single bruise or scratch on their skin, as if an unseen force had protected them. Mr. Obi, however, was not as fortunate. Sitting in the front seat, the impact had crushed his legs. He was alive, but his legs were gone. The rescuers hurried him to the hospital, his family trailing closely behind, their hearts heavy, yet thankful that he was still breathing. At the hospital, Adaobi knelt beside her husband's bed, her children gathered around her. Tears streamed down her face as she prayed, "Lord, you saved us from the accident. Please don't take my husband. Let him live." Mr. Obi's injuries were grave, and the doctors labored through the night, fighting to save him. By morning, he was awake, weak but alive. The news of his survival spread, filling Adaobi's heart with immense gratitude. Later that day, the elderly woman whom Mr. Obi had assisted days earlier entered the hospital room. Her steps were slow, yet her presence was undeniably strong. She approached his bedside, her eyes filled with understanding. "Do you remember me?" she inquired. Mr. Obi nodded faintly. "Yes, Mama." The old woman took a seat and began to speak. "I warned you not to go to the village this Christmas. I urged you to pray and fast, but you chose not to listen." She shook her head, her voice gentle yet resolute. "If it weren't for your wife's prayers, you and your children would have perished by now." Tears welled in Mr. Obi's eyes as he glanced at Adaobi, who stood quietly with her hands clasped. The old woman continued, "Your stepmother, Mama Emeka, and the village witches conspired against you. They cast a curse, but God's power surpasses their schemes. It was your wife's prayers that created a protective barrier around your family. Overcome with emotion, Mr. Obi broke down, tears streaming down his face. I was foolish, he admitted, his voice quivering. I didn't listen. I didn't pray. What happened years ago changed me. He remembered his youth, when his mother had dragged him to church every Sunday, when the promise of miracles had seemed so real, so tangible. But life had a way of wearing down belief. He'd watched the sick remain sick, the poor remain poor, despite all the prayers. Faith had given him hope once, but the disappointments had chipped away at it until it was nothing more than an echo. The church was a place of comfort for many, but for him, it was a hollow space. He saw the rituals, the desperate cries, and the hopeful faces, and wondered why it was that faith only seemed to favor the fortunate, the ones who had the luxury of believing without fear. His skepticism wasn't just born out of anger, it was born from pain. He had watched too many people he loved, including his own father, hold on to faith only to be let down. The old woman placed her hands on his shoulders and said, I understand you, my child. It is not easy to follow the path of God, but let this be a lesson. Never underestimate the power of prayer. Never ignore the warnings of God. From that moment on, Mr. Obi became a completely changed man. After his hospital discharge, he embraced a new life, starting each day by calling his family for morning prayers, kneeling in gratitude for God's mercy. On Sundays, he was the first to arrive at church, his voice ringing out the loudest during worship. However, Mr. Obi never returned to the village for Christmas again. The painful memories of his past and the betrayal by his stepmother haunted him. It wasn't until many years later, after the passing of Mama Emeka and Mama Obina, that he found the courage to revisit the village, this time with a humble heart and a spirit full of gratitude. The story of Mr. Obi's accident and miraculous recovery spread throughout the community, serving as a powerful reminder that prayer is a formidable shield against life's dangers and that not everyone is happy for your success. If you found this story captivating, please give it a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments about what you learned, and subscribe for more enchanting stories like this one. Do not stop praying. Pray always, because prayer is the key. Thank you for watching. See you in my next video. Bye.